From this day forward, the Supreme Soviet of the Russian Federation and its deputies discontinue their legislative, administrative, and executive functions.
It's August 1999. Russia is falling apart. The ruble has crashed. The Chechen war is a mess, and Boris Yeltsin's approval rating is below 10%. The Kremlin is in a panic, knowing they could face prosecution once Yeltsin leaves. Their priority isn't saving Russia, it's saving themselves. And that's why Yeltsin fires his Prime Minister Sergei Stepashin and replaces him with the loyal Vladimir Putin. Today, Putin is one of the most infamous leaders in modern history, a tyrant who drastically changed the 21st century. But here's the thing, Yeltsin's decision to make Putin prime minister almost didn't happen. Yeltsin had initially trusted Stepashin, but began to doubt him when Stepashin hesitated to take military action in Chechnya. If Sergei Stepashin acted stronger against Chechnya in August 1999, our modern world would look radically different. On July 31, 1999, Islamist fighters crossed from Chechnya into Dagestan. In our timeline, Russian Prime Minister Stepashin delayed committing large forces to avoid escalation. That led to Yeltsin losing trust, and well, the rest is history. But in this alternate world, Stepashin doesn't hesitate so much. On August 1st, Stepashin declares a state of emergency in Dagestan. He authorizes limited airstrikes and sends in Interior Ministry troops. Publicly, he frames his reaction as defending Russian integrity, not restarting the Chechen war. Yeltsin and his inner circle are still skeptical. They know the decision they are about to make will decide both the future of Russia and, more importantly, if they'll go to jail or not. Yeltsin's approval is in the gutter and his second term will end in less than a year. The oligarchs know Yeltsin needs a strong and loyal successor. They are terrified of prosecution, but they are also greedy. Stepashin might be dull, but dull can be useful. His actions against Chechnya speak volume, but he also seems controllable. By August 6, Russian troops successfully push militants back into Chechnya. Stepashin visits the region in person. TV cameras capture him in military uniform, inspecting troops and reassuring locals. Russian state media portrays him as strong but rational, exactly what Yeltsin wants to see. Yeltsin's advisors report a spike in Stepashin's popularity. Key players inside Yeltsin's inner circle, like Boris Berezovsky, now decide that it's safer to keep him than to gamble on an unknown like Putin. On August 9, instead of being fired, Stepashin holds a press conference declaring that order in Dagestan has been restored. Vladimir Putin, meanwhile, remains the deputy of the Security Council. A decently powerful role, but nothing compared to the Prime Minister, who is now seen as a rare, stabilizing figure after years of chaos. The Russian military praises his limited but successful response. Stepashin stopped short of a full invasion of Chechnya. Instead, he opts for a containment strategy, sealing the border and supporting local anti-militant groups. He avoids full escalation. Now, historically, in September 1999, large-scale apartment bombings killed around 300 civilians and shocked Russia to its core. Putin blamed the bombings on Chechen terrorists, so you'd think that they'd still happen in this timeline, but I am not so sure. Many researchers have long suspected FSB involvement, likely to justify Putin's brutal crackdown on Chechnya. But with Stepashin still in power, there is no need for those brutal crackdowns. And while this is hard to say for certain, I think that without Putin, the apartment bombings never happen. And without the apartment bombings of September 1999, there is no reason to start the Second Chechen War. Yes, Chechnya is super unstable and Chechen militants are fighting against Russian-backed militants, but the Russian army never invades. We are just a month into the Divergence Point and Russia is already way more stable. In our time, Boris Yeltsin resigned early on December 31st, 1999, making Putin president. In this timeline, Yeltsin still is in deep political trouble, but without the Second Chechen War, there is no need to resign early. Berezovsky and other oligarchs quietly make non-prosecution pacts with Stepashin in exchange for backing him in the 2000 presidential election. And with that, Stepashin quickly becomes the frontrunner. He positions himself as a professional politician and a non-corrupt continuation of Yeltsin's legacy. He's also mildly pro-Western, anti-extremist and cautious cautiously supportive of reforms. His main adversary is Gennady Zyuganov from the Communist Party, who campaigns against oligarchs and economic injustice. But with pro-Kremlin media and the oligarchs backing Stepashin, the race really isn't close. On March 26, Sergei Stepashin wins the third Russian election after the fall of the USSR with 65% of the votes. History just changed. Instead of an authoritarian and a brutal second Chechen war, Russia enters the 21st century with more stability and a bureaucrat as elected president. While Stepashin is inaugurated as Russia's second president, the country is still in a tough spot. Chechen militants are contained by local forces, but violent clashes still happen occasionally. But the biggest initial change happens somewhere else. Russia's infamous intelligence agency, the FSB, aka the continuation of the KGB, now sees drastic changes. In our time, Putin consolidated power of the agency and turned it into a political tool that obeys his will, and his will only. In this timeline, the FSB remains a professional intelligence service without major political influences. Putin consolidating the FSB was a major step towards dictatorship. In this timeline, Russia remains a democracy. However, that doesn't mean the FSB is suddenly powerless. The Siloviki, aka powerful, power-hungry men inside Russia's security apparatus, still exist, and they're still power-hungry. But without Putin's consolidation of state power, they need to look elsewhere to gain influence. The Siloviki now operate more like oligarchs, expanding their power in the private sector through shady deals. Basically, the price for Russia to not turn authoritarian and ultra-nationalist is even more oligarch corruption. But in comparison, that's at least manageable. During late 2000, global oil prices rise quickly. That is great for the Russian economy, which now stabilizes and grows. Diplomatically, President Stepashin cultivates decent ties with the US and Europe, but they're not nearly as skeptical as in our time. Stepashin even visits Bill Clinton in the White House shortly before the 2000 election. Speaking of the 2000 election, while it was close, nothing changes there. George W. Bush is elected president, just like in our time. Globally, early and mid-2001 plays out quite similar as well. The Russian economy grows gradually. Oligarchs hold large-scale control, but independent institutions also grow in power. Russia now enjoys basic levels of press freedom, and some small, independent news agencies begin uncovering the oligarchs' corruption. And just as things seem to quiet down, the earth is shaken to its core on September 11, 2001. President Stepashin immediately condemns the attack harshly. After Bush starts the infamous war on terror,
the military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations.
Russia begins the limited intelligence sharing with the US and NATO. It's mostly focused on border security. In our time, Putin exploited the global terror fears to justify further crackdowns and claimed Chechnya is a breeding ground for jihad. Stepashin doesn't do that. He's a technocrat and he knows those claims aren't true. I know this isn't super exciting, but Stepashin really is just a boring politician. But sometimes all it needs for the world to radically change towards the better is a boring politician. In the 2000s, Russia is seen as a stable nation the West can cooperate with. The giant country is now in a similar spot to many former Eastern Bloc nations like Poland or Romania in the 90s. Corruption is high, things are chaotic, but they're moving into the right direction. In 2003, the US launches its infamous invasion of Iraq. Russia largely remains neutral. Stepashin vaguely condemns the invasion and warns about Western overreach. During that time, he also launches large-scale military reforms, focused on modernization instead of raw power displays. He also meets Bush several times in the White House to discuss nuclear disarmament possibilities and bilateral anti-terror coordination. As 2004 rolls around, both the American and Russian elections are approaching. Again, in the US, nothing much changes. But in Russia, without Putin's harsh crackdowns, opposition parties have freedom to operate. There's both communist and liberal opposition to Stepashin's government, but neither have the reach to truly challenge his power. And while corruption has stalled thanks to Stepashin, he is still letting most oligarchs off the hook. Boris Yeltsin and his inner circle still aren't in jail, and they've only only grown richer. And thus, they of course support Stepashin during this election yet again. The state media also paints him in a very positive light. He stabilized the Russian economy, brought Russia respect on the international stage, and avoided a disaster in Chechnya. While Russia by this point technically is a democracy, the election is not really all that fair. Because the oligarchs back Stepashin, he gets basically all the media spotlight. Press freedom exists, but it's not up to Western standards. Internationally, journalists closely monitor the election in Russia. They criticize Stepashin's unfair advantages, while political analysts classify Russia as a flawed democracy. What they don't know is how much worse things truly could have been. There's no large-scale voter intimidation, no crackdowns against opposition parties, and no journalists are jailed for criticizing the president. Stepashin wins re-election with 55% of the vote. That sounds strong, but Putin got 72%. Besides Stepashin, the big winner of this election is the Communist Party. Their candidate, Gennady Zyuganov, got 36% of the vote, much more than anyone expected. While in opposition, his power is growing drastically. Throughout the following years, Stepashin continues with his policies without many scandals. Fighting in Chechnya slowly quiets down. The infamous warlord Ramzan Kadyrov is forced to flee to Syria. Moscow reaches several agreements for semi-autonomy with Chechnya, leading to similar arrangements Dagestan has with Russia today. In 2004, Ukraine's Orange Revolution still happens, but crucially, this time Russia is neutral. The revolution succeeds more cleanly. In Ukraine begins genuine democratization. By 2008, Ukraine signs an association deal with the EU much earlier than in our time. Economically, Russia is also in a pretty good spot. Following the 2000s oil boom, their economy grows fast. This time, the wealth is spread more evenly between oligarchs instead of being consolidated around Putin's inner circle. The Russian middle class also expands and Moscow modernizes faster. Russian tech and manufacturing receive more Western investments, similarly to early 2000s Poland. Russia is now a highly engaged member of the G8. For those who don't know, the G7 used to be the G8 until Russia was expelled in 2014 for annexing Crimea.
Latest on the tense standoff between the U.S. and Russia over the Ukraine crisis. Russian President Putin firing back after President Obama announced a new round of U.S. sanctions against Russia on Thursday.
Relations with Europe gradually improve as energy exports expand via Finland, Germany and Ukraine. There also is no 2006 Russia-Ukraine gas dispute, since Gazprom is never weaponized in this timeline. As Stepashin's second term is coming to an end, Russia can be best described as a managed democracy. It has all the democratic freedoms on paper, but oligarchs hold way too much power. But crucially, there's now competition between the corrupt oligarchs, which prevents any party from gaining total control. By 2008, once again, both Russia and the US are headed for another election. Whomever these two nations will choose will drastically change the trajectory of their countries, and with that also change the trajectory of the modern world. Stepashin, being a normal politician, respects Russia's constitution and doesn't run for a third term. With him out, three strong candidates emerge. First, Viktor Krishchenko, Stepashin's technocratic deputy, the safe, pro-Western choice. Then there's Gennady Zyuganov, the charismatic communist populist, stronger than ever. And finally, Sergei Shoigu, the highly respected Minister of Emergency Situations, pitching himself as an everyman patriot. Each candidate is surrounded by loads of uncertainty. There's no clear favorite, and that is new territory for Russia. There never has been a Russian election without a clear frontrunner. Oligarchs scramble to put their weight behind candidates, but this time they aren't united. The communist Zyuganov has used harsh anti-oligarchy rhetoric in his campaigns, so they all put their weight behind Krishchenko and Shoigu. The media is also split, and suddenly, for the first time in Russian history, TV debates actually matter. Russia Today invites all three candidates. They all pitch their stories and ideas for the future. Zyuganov uses patriotic populism. He condemns oligarchs and claims that the new Russian stability only serves them and not the people. He comes off strong, charismatic, but also radical. Shoigu talks about his work as the Minister of Emergency Situations, one of the most respected secret political roles in Russia. He reassures Russians that he will protect them. He will protect Russia's democracy and strengthens its institutions while making the state stronger. He comes off as smart, respectable and moderate. And I know how crazy that sounds, knowing what kind of figure Shoigu is today. But back in 2008, he really was one of the most respected politicians in Russia. Christenko presents himself as a stable technocrat, a low-drama continuation of the last 8 years. He vows to keep inflation low, to keep the ruble stable and to integrate Russia further into the West. He comes off as disciplined but also rehearsed. He sounds more like a civil servant reading policy briefs. In the first round in March 2008, the vote is split. Zyuganov leads with 38%, followed by Shoigu with 36%. Christenko holds 20%, forcing him to concede. The election is now a runoff between Shoigu and Zyuganov, and things quickly intensify. Christenko reluctantly endorses Shoigu. Oligarchs and large media corporations also throw their weight behind Shoigu. Advertisements for him break all records. Zyuganov doubles down on his anti-oligarchy rhetoric as he rallies his supporters in the streets. In Western media, the Russian election is portrayed as the most competitive Russian election in history. In the runoff in April, Shoigu manages to narrowly win with 52%. Zyuganov concedes gracefully, but vows to continue leading the opposition. Stepashin's government prepares to hand over power to Shoigu, who's now forming his cabinet. The election just proved to both Russia and the world that democracy in a post-authoritarian country can work. And now, the time for real change begins. In the same year as Shoigu takes office, the global economy crashes and Obama is elected in the US. The economic crash hits Russia like a train. Oil prices fall, capital flees and unemployment rises. But Shoigu, with his reputation as a crisis manager, responds quickly. He launches massive infrastructure programs to sustain employment. And with sovereign wealth funds built up under Stepashin, he bails out key industries and prevents bank collapses. He also nationalizes some failing oligarch assets, not ideologically like Zyuganov would have, but pragmatically. This response is great on paper, but in practice things aren't so rosy. And that summarizes our alternate Russia perfectly. The country has Western laws, principles of democracy and press freedom, but in reality the oligarchs still hold way too much power. Even with Shoigu's decisive actions, Russia recovers much slower from the financial crisis than Western nations, largely thanks to oligarchs hijacking assets meant to serve the public. Following the crash, Russia experiences a new massive wave of anti-oligarchy and anti-Western sentiments. Shoigu's approval rating quickly drops below 30%, while the communist opposition surges in popularity. Zyuganov holds weekly anti-oligarchy rallies and in 2010 is even target of a failed assassination attempt, which only strengthens his popularity. Shoigu, in an attempt to counter these developments, begins moving closer and closer to the West. In 2010, he invites Obama to Moscow to sign a historic agreement. In the Kremlin's Grand Hall, Shoigu and Obama shake hands under a banner reading, "Status signed, a safer world begins." The two nations just agreed to demilitarize their nuclear weapons drastically, but this doesn't save Shoigu's approval ratings. He positioned Russia as a neutral power, but the state is still corrupt to the bone. Shoigu focuses on integrating Russia into the European economy while maintaining strong trade with China. And with that doctrine, Russia quickly becomes the middle ground between the EU and China. Both diplomatically and economically, Russia helps link the two blocs closer together. By 2011, that tactic begins bearing fruit and the Russian economy grows again. But the true winner of this new economic world order is China. Thanks to Russia, China can ramp up trade with Europe. Bypassing less reliable routes through the Middle East, the Chinese economy grows much more rapidly in this timeline. And that's the main focus of Western analysis. Western politicians don't even notice the surge of left-wing populism in Russia, since everyone is focused on countering China. And thus, it's an even bigger shock to the Western world when the communist populist Zyuganov wins the 2012 Russian election in a landslide with 63% of the votes. He campaigned on nationalizing oligarchy assets and anti-Western foreign policy, and now he is president of Russia. to the West, this is like a punch in the stomach. The whole belief that democracy and capitalism can prevent communism from rising again was just shattered. Western ideology is not as untouchable as it seemed. The 2012 Russian election becomes a true wake-up call for the Western world. Western analysts assumed that Russia would move closer and closer to the West, since it would have been the smart move economically. But they haven't considered how deeply corrupt Russia truly is. And that corruption was the perfect breeding ground for populism. Not Putin's ultra-nationalist kind of populism, but left-wing pro-communism populism. Western media portrays the election like Russia just resurrected Stalin, but in reality Zyuganov is better comparable to Khrushchev. Upon entering office, he quickly begins working hard against Russian oligarchs. State institutions are set up with the sole task to investigate oligarchs. Zyuganov also quickly expands his powers over the FSB and uses their assets to spy on the oligarchs. It sounds a lot like Putin's playbook, but it's really the opposite. Yes, Zyuganov brings public assets under his control, just like Putin, but he does it to fight the very people that stood closest behind Putin. The oligarchs, of course, fight back. They use their assets to block and sabotage Zyuganov as much as possible. Russian media, controlled by oligarchs, criticizes him harshly, but most people don't care. Russians are tired of the decades of corruption. They're tired of oligarchs controlling politics, and they're tired of Western capitalism controlling if they can feed their families. To Russians, the 2008 crash was proof that capitalism doesn't work, and Zyuganov promises to move away from that towards a system more closely resembling China. But he also promised isolationism, and on that he quickly delivers. He withdraws Russia from the START II nuclear disarmament agreement and stops intelligence sharing with NATO. Russian operations in the Middle East also quickly come to a halt. With Zyuganov in power, Russian mercenaries never fight French forces in the Sahel, and Russia never backs Assad's regime in Syria. And without that, Assad's power quickly crumbles. And while Zyuganov is anti-Western diplomatically, he is not hostile towards the West, more like indifferent. In Russia's neighbor Ukraine, pro-EU sentiments are stronger than ever. And while Zyuganov isn't happy about that, his hands are too tied up in internal affairs to do anything about Ukrainian politics. By 2014, Ukraine, instead of being invaded by Russia, joins the European Union. In Europe, that's celebrated as a big success. In Russia, most people don't really care. Zyuganov vaguely condemns the EU, but oligarchs sense an opportunity to protect their assets from being seized by Zyuganov. They quickly move them into Ukraine and thus the European market. Companies like Gazprom quickly set up massive offices in Kiev and Odessa before Zyuganov's government can react. And that hurts the Russian economy massively. Russians are now losing jobs even quicker than during the 2008 crash. Zyuganov tries to save jobs by expanding infrastructure projects, but just like Shoigu, he fails. As the 2016 Russian election approaches, Zyuganov's approval rating begins to drop. And right as the year turns, Assad's regime falls in Syria. Rebels take over Damascus while Assad flees to Iran. But those aren't the only ripple effects of this timeline. Every change, every election, and every decision so far in this timeline has really led us to one pivotal year, 2016. A year that had both in this timeline and ours two of the arguably most important elections in modern history. Zyuganov is of course running for re-election in Russia, but his base isn't motivated anymore, and there's a very strong opposition candidate, Alexei Kudrin, who served as finance minister under both Stepashin and Shoigu. He's pro-Western, pro-democracy, and is seen as highly competent both by elites, the media, and the population. And his message is strong. On television, he tells Russians, Zyuganov fought the oligarchs and won, but he lost their peace. He has no plan for prosperity. I do. After the chaos of the Red Era, a majority of Russians, even those who hate the oligarchs, are ultimately more afraid of poverty than they are angry at corruption. And so, Kudrin manages to win with 57% of the votes. Russia has tested communism once again, and once again it has rejected it. But the truly world-changing elections of 2016 are yet to come. One will take place in June 2016, when the UK will vote whether to stay in the European Union or not. And the even bigger one, arguably the most important election of the 21st century, will take place in November, when the Americans have to decide whether Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump should lead them. In our timeline, Russia meddled in both of those elections, but without Putin in power, both political motivation and power to influence either of those elections simply doesn't exist. Especially with Putin in power, there is no way Russia would attempt to influence either. Now, the true impact of Russian interference is hotly debated, but we know it was extensive. However, Russia not interfering is not the only thing that changes in this timeline. Remember the Syrian civil war, the refugee crisis that resulted from it, and the EU's reaction to it fueled a widespread rise in anti-immigration and anti-EU sentiments across Europe, but especially in the UK. In this timeline, the Syrian civil war still happened, but it's already over, and the resulting refugee crisis was much more contained. Now there's simply less propaganda fuel to use against the EU. Sure, there would still be many geezers motivated enough to vote for Brexit, but there's no way the Brexit crowd would see nearly the same turnout in this timeline. That alone would probably be enough, but on top, with Ukraine joining the EU in 2014, the Union is generally seen as much more of a success story. In this timeline, the UK votes to remain in the European Union. Far-right populism thrives on fear, which of course still exists in this timeline. But with a pro-Western president in Russia, the big powerful bear is no enemy on the world stage. The world generally is seen as a much more peaceful place than in our time. The Syrian civil war is already over. Without Assad, Iran is much less of a global threat, and Ukraine is in the EU instead of fighting Russian insurgents. The only real big enemy the US still has in this timeline is China. Now, don't get me wrong, the domestic anger and economic anxiety that Trump tapped into was very real and still exists here, but without a constant drumbeat of fear about foreign threats and a rigged system amplified from abroad. That anger just wouldn't be quite enough to push him over the edge in key swing states. With the world generally seeming like a much safer place, people are simply less likely to opt for a strongman. So on November 8, 2016, Hillary Clinton becomes the first woman elected as president. The election was much closer than most analysts expected, but still, she won. Once in office, she quickly begins working. One of her big focuses is a new strategy of working with Russia to counter China's growing influence. Shortly after her inauguration, President Putin visits her in the White House. The two leaders begin building close diplomatic ties. By mid-2017, Russia rejoins the START II agreement and once again begins demilitarizing its nuclear warheads. And there you have it, a world without Putin. Russia is disarming its nukes. The US and Russia are more closely aligned than ever. Ukraine joined and Britain remained in the EU. The Syrian civil war is over. I could now go on about how things would continue in this world, how there would be no Ukraine war or widespread rise of right-wing populism across Europe, but I think you get the picture. This timeline is already unimaginably better than ours. Going anywhere beyond this would honestly break my brain. This timeline in 2025 would probably sound like a utopian parody of our world. All because Boris Yeltsin didn't fire Sergei Stepashin in August 1999. In my humble opinion, Vladimir Putin is the most destructive person of the 21st century. Even if we completely ignore the Ukraine war, his legacy has been pulling the world back towards authoritarianism, global tensions, and a new Cold War. We really could have had a nice thing going without the biggest grifter in modern history. I truly don't think the world hates Putin enough. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed my attempt to illustrate how much Putin fucked us over. If you did, please consider subscribing. As always, a special thanks to my loyal Patreons who helped make this video possible. If you want a video with a similar kind of feel, check out my video about one judge voting differently in 2000, resulting in an Al Gore presidency.